Hey guys, I'm Mark, and today we're going to talk about my really fancy new dog kennel that also doubles as a nice, classy piece of furniture that is permanently here in the living room. We used to have a really crappy old plastic one that was held together with hot glue and duct tape, and it sat in here for way too long, so this is a huge upgrade from that. It's all black walnut. It also has HDPE plastic decorative panels built in all four sides. There's a door on this long end and there's a door on the short end over there, so that depending on how it's oriented with other furniture, if it's pushed up against the couch or the wall, there's always an access door that can be pointed in the direction that you need it to be pointed. Throughout the video, there's a bunch of different explanations as to why I did things the way I did them, so we don't need to hash any more of that out right now. We just need to get right into the build. All right guys, let's get started. Just like the majority of my projects, this one starts by breaking down and squaring up some rough lumber. I use my jigsaw to cut this black walnut to rough length, leaving it a few inches long to account for snipe during the planing process. Then I pass one face and one edge over the joiner to get a perfect 90-degree corner. After that, everything goes through the planer until it's perfect on both faces and brought down to 3/4 of an inch thick. Sometimes my rough sawn stuff can get a little wacky, so I save myself quite a bit of material loss by cutting to length first, rather than trying to run a full-length board through this process. Most of this project is built out of equal size sticks, so I set up my fence and roller guides at the table saw and work my way through the whole pile of boards. Then, I square off one end of each of these little boards before flipping them end for end and cutting them to their final length according to my cut list. As long as we're here at the table saw, I use it to break down a sheet of HDPE, which is a fancy way of saying some kind of plastic. From there, I put some masking tape on the sheets, then shove them in my laser so it can cut out a fancy pattern. HDPE tends to be a bit melty, but with the right settings, it still cuts pretty clean. The only exception is the point where the laser first fires on a new shape, which results in a slight divot in the face of the material. After a little trial and error, I found that adding the masking tape seems to clear up most of the issue. Peeling the tape back off is a little bit of a pain, but the result is worth it. This project is mostly made up of a bunch of frames that are connected to legs. There are 6 frames total, 4 sides and 2 doors. The process for making them is all the same, you just have to get the sizes right. I put the pieces down on a flat surface so I could generally line them up and labeled the joints. Then after marking center on each of the sticks, I flushed up the edges and transferred that line onto both sides of the joint. In order to connect the pieces, we're going to use Craig's new loose tenon jig called the Mortise Mate. This handsome fella is capable of cutting very precise mortises that are 6, 8, or 10 millimeters in size. All you have to do to swap between the 3 sizes is get yourself a different bit and some tenons to match. Set the stop collar on your bit at whatever clearly marked depth you want, and you're good to go. It comes with a plywood mini work surface, which makes clamping easy, and I attached mine to a thick piece of walnut with a few strategic cuts in it, so I could use some little fence clamps to hold it to my workbench with minimal obstructions. It works by locking the cutter into whatever drill you already have, then sliding it through the guide hole and camming it back and forth to hog out your mortise. The notches in the work surface are there to allow clamps to get up close and personal and hold your material securely. The auto-indexing mechanism plunges the bit in deeper with each full move of the lever. You just have to ratchet it back and forth until it reaches the bottom. Then you push the release button and the mechanism pops back out so it's ready for the next one. The thickness of your mortise is dictated by your cutter, but the width is adjustable by moving these little stops in or out from either side. So if you want a loose fit that you can line up later during glue up, then leave these wide. I took the time to dial them in perfectly to match the size of my tenons so that everything was perfectly aligned during assembly. It was a little tedious to reach that level of perfection, but once I had mine set, I did this entire project without making another adjustment, and every joint came together perfectly. One last little note about the Mortise Mate, it has a very effective dust collection port built into it. With the shop vac running, it seemed to be 100% effective. However, if you want to skip the dust collection, the function of the tool didn't seem to be affected by it, and you just end up with a neat little pile of chips down by your toes. With all the mortises cut, I'd tried a dry fit first just to be sure everything was aligned correctly. Then I put a bunch of glue in all the holes and swabbed it around a bit before pushing in the tenons and fitting the parts together. I pulled the joints tight with a pair of clamps and kept the squeeze out in check as I went along to save on the cleanup for later. Then I repeated the process for all 6 frames. The 2x2 legs were milled up and cut to length the same way as the frame material. These are 1/16 of an inch longer than the frames. That way, when it's assembled, only the legs will touch the floor and the whole kennel doesn't rock on the rails in the event of an uneven floor. Back on my flat surface, I clamped the legs to the frames with the tops flush, labeling every mating face as I worked my way around the kennel. The frame is resting on some 1/2-inch scrap to space it up into the legs just a bit and create a more interesting look, rather than just being flush with the inside or the outside. Then, I measured for the locations of the next mortises and transferred those marks across both components. Back at the mortise mate, I cut my tenons into the sides of the frames just like I did with the individual components, and it just so happened that my legs were about the right thickness to help hold things up while I lined up my marks and clamped them in place. The mortise mate has measurements on the front face, and these correspond to your material thickness. So if you have a 3/4 inch material, you set it to 3/4, and the hole will be lined up in the center of your board. To align the jig on the legs, I dropped the work surface so that the same scrap spacer I used during the layout lined up with the 0.75 graduation on the scale. This way, the frames will sit within the legs just exactly where we planned them. After cutting a bunch more mortises, we're ready to see if everything lines up correctly during one final dry assembly. I tap a few tenons into place in each leg, then slide on the corresponding frame edge. Before long, I've worked around the whole kennel and everything is lined up perfectly. I relabeled all the mating surfaces along the top edge so I could remove my tape labels and break everything down for sanding without causing any problems later. Because of the slight frame inset, we created a corner on the inside that will get in the way of our bottom, so I ran the legs over the table saw to remove this corner. Another possibility would have been to make little notches in the corners of the bottom board, but this seemed easier. Now is also the time to add a shallow curve to the top edge of the frames to accommodate the Z-clips I'll be using to attach the top. I actually made a slight error here in doing this, but I'll explain that a little later. Let's talk about my decorative plastic panels for a second. Originally, I considered cutting grooves in the center of the frame pieces and building the frames around the panels, completely capturing them. Then I started thinking, if other people have dogs who are chewers or just generally more destructive than mine, they could eventually wreck those panels and they would be nearly impossible to replace. So I decided I would be better off insetting them into a rabbet in the frame and screwing them in from the back. This is very strong, it looks clean from the outside, and would be easy to replace if needed. So, right from the start, I planned on cutting these rabbets on my router table after the frames were assembled. What I didn't anticipate was just how miserable the tear out was going to be, even though I was going slow and taking tiny little bites at a time. See, the problem is, the big bit I have cuts cleanly going in, but on the exit, it was pushing the wood fibers away from the board. That is, if you're pushing in the appropriate or safe direction. What I figured out is if I fed my material on the wrong side of the bit, it cut perfectly clean. The problem is, that meant my router table was always trying to accelerate my material and throw it at me. So instead of feeding the material, I just held it down firmly against the table and acted as a brake to make it move more slowly and with more control. I absolutely don't recommend that anyone do this, but I found myself in need of a solution and it worked for me. I included this so that you can learn from my mistakes. Next time, I would either A, cut the rabbets before assembly, B, start with a much bigger bearing on my bit, forcing an even smaller bite and progressing through the bearings until the cut was completed correctly. Or finally C, I could have just drawn a simple square in VCarve Pro and let my CNC machine cut the rabbet for me. In case you were wondering, I was able to fix the first one I had cut that had terrible tear out using some CA glue and strategic sanding to the point that you couldn't even find it now if I challenged you to.
Okay, everybody, let's go. Come on, quiet down, quiet down. Come on, quiet down, quiet down. We got somebody from HR coming down. They want to discuss, I think it's Employee of the Month times. I know, we want to get back to work, but just quiet down. This will be quick. Miss Katie, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Happy 2025. As you probably know, since I'm here, we are celebrating Employee of the Month this morning. Over the last few weeks, we've been really busy getting all of those holiday orders out, and Employee of the Month is reflecting that hard work that we've done. So I'm very excited to announce that Employee of the Month this month is Tape Gun. Let's have a round of applause for Tape Gun. All right, thank you. I have just a few other items that I want to touch on this morning. We do have an upcoming trade show So the next few weeks are going to be really busy. As we all remember, this time of year is incredibly busy for laser. So if we could all be cognizant of how we're using laser's time, that would be really great. We need laser to be able to concentrate on getting all of those projects out the door. I also wanted to touch on some unsafe practices that we've seen in the footage that has come out of the shop. Mark, we talked about this.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to do better. Okay, that is everything I had for you all. Thank you for your time this morning, and congratulations to Tape Gun.
All right, thanks, Katie. Anybody, break time's over. Everybody get back to work. We wasted too much time on this already.
Mark, a word.
Let's jump over and work on the top for a while. I already glued together a few boards, then evened them out by passing them through the planer. These boards have quite a bit of character, which means knots and voids, so I mixed up some slow-setting epoxy with a few drops of black, then poured it into the holes in the top, with some tape on the back to avoid leaking through. After that cured for a day, I ran the board back through the planer to knock down the high spots. The first glue-up didn't use anything other than glue and clamps, because I had the option of the planer to even things out. But now with the center seam, I used the mortise mate to cut just a few more mortises to aid in the alignment. Any variation in the boards along this seam would add hours to the amount of hand sanding I needed to do. But with the tenons holding them perfectly flush, the seam disappeared and all I had to do was add glue and clamps. After it dried, I used a track saw to square off the ends and cut it to length. And then it was time for some sanding. I grabbed my trusty SurfPrep sander and...
Hey, is this really the best footage we have for this? I mean, it's both washed out and shadowy at the same time. No, that's just the same shot, just zoomed in a little. Okay, now I know we're going to talk about the right angle sanding attachment, but we're still fighting with idiotic lighting. It's really confusing the auto exposure, and we already know how dumb he is. Okay, great. So we had good footage all along. Thanks for wasting everyone's time, Gary.
I used my SurfPrep sander, used code Gunflint10 for 10% off their website, and worked my way through the grits on the top. Then I slapped on the right angle adapter to do the edges without rounding over my sharp corners. You can get yourself one of these adapters at McFarland Customs. I grabbed my trim router and added a slight chamfer to the front edge of the panel openings before sanding all of the frames and legs as well. At this point, with all the great care I took during the setup, the actual glue up was incredibly simple. I slathered glue around inside the mortises, then tapped in the tenons. Then I slid the legs in place against the long side frames and clamped them together. After the long side assemblies dried, I added the short sides onto one of them to create a big 3-sided frame and allowed it to dry. I had enough other steps I could work on in between short drying times to keep myself busy, and this staggered assembly kept things low stress by involving fewer clamps and zero rushing. Finally, I added glue and tenons to the last frame, set it in place, and gave it a good clamping. I did also use a small amount of glue on the edges of the frames, and I cleaned up any squeeze out as I went along this process. Tongue oil is one of my favorite finishes because of looks and ease of use. I used it on the frame because I could just flood it on with a rag, mushing however much I needed to into the corners so every surface got hit, then just wiped off the excess. This made it easy to get finish into all the little corners created by all those 90-degree angles. For the top, I went with a little different finish. For look and durability, General Finish's Armor Seal probably takes my #1 spot, but I don't use it much because it takes a very long time to do correctly. It takes about 24 hours per coat and requires a minimum of 3 coats.
Gary, come on, focus. Thank you, Gary.
Usually I'm in too big of a hurry to spend 3 days on finish, and it also shuts my shop down because I can't make dust while it dries. But in this case, we were in the middle of my kids' Christmas break and I was taking some time off, so once a day I would sneak out and do another coat and ended up with a total of 5, and man was it worth it. For the bottom of the kennel, I cut a piece of plywood that fits snugly inside the frame, then used the Craig 720 Pro to drill a bunch of pocket holes in the bottom side of it. Using a right angle clamp and a rag to pad the jaw against my freshly finished exterior face, I lined up the edges with the bottoms of the frame and ran in a bunch of screws. Now you might be thinking that I could have installed this any number of other ways, but just like the plastic panels, I wanted this component to be replaceable. Imagine if you have a new puppy or an old dog that has accidents, or you just have a wild critter that manages to dig so hard they wreck it. Being able to replace the bottom will help keep your kennel looking and smelling better. I laid the box on its side and fit the panels in place, then pre-drilled holes and ran in screws that were short enough to keep from poking through the front. After installing all the panels, I used a spacer block and attached the hinges to the frame. These hinges have removable pins, making installation easier. For the latch, I'm using this little turny knobby guy, and I marked the location for just one of the 4 mounting holes. I lined it up and used an awl to mark my spot, then pre-drilled and ran in a screw. After checking for alignment, I used my center finding bit to drill the other 3 holes, then tightened it down. Then for the catch on the frame side, I just held it over the latch and drilled a hole. I added the screw and checked to make sure the mechanism functioned before adding the second one.
So we are right here at the end. All I have to do is attach the top to this thing, and I'm going to use little Z-clips to do it. So earlier on, I thought about exactly how I was going to do it. I cut this little kerf on the table saw, and I only did it on the 2 long ends, and these things will hook in there, and then they'll screw into the underside of the top and hold it down. And I made one little mistake with that, and I did it on the 2 sides, but not on the 2 ends, thinking, well, I'm accounting for wood movement. There's no sense in doing it on the other sides, but I just, in a hurry, misidentified the direction that the wood moves. Well, the wood isn't going to move lengthwise with this. The wood is going to move seasonally widthwise with this. So if I have these hooked in on either side and it expands, it's going to push them out further. And if it contracts, it's going to pull these out of those. So I thought ahead, I did it right, but I did it wrong. No big deal. I can't run this over the table saw now, so what I'm going to do is use my biscuit joiner to just cut a couple of different grooves into it so that now I can put the Z-clips in the ends and attach that to the underside of the top. No big deal, just wish I would have caught it sooner.
I was right in the middle of a cold for that last explanation, so you probably noticed that my voice lacked a certain level of excitement. That's because all I really wanted to do was go back inside and leave this for another day. But I powered through and cut my biscuit holes just like a real trooper, so I could put this project to bed. With the top upside down on my bench, I herniated the crate upside down on top of it, then used a 1/2 inch spacer to get the overhang matching on all sides. Then I marked hole locations, pre-drilled some holes, and tightened the Z-clips to lock the top and base together. I added some felt to the feet to help protect our floors a bit, then the work was done. All that was left was to toss in a cheap plastic kennel liner and a comfy pad, then introduce it to its new tenant.
Come here, Alex. Come here. Up. Oh. Huh? Ken. Oh, what do you think? What do you think? Down. That's a good dog. That's a good dog. Can we lock you in there and just see how you fit? You like being in the dog box, don't you? What a good boy. Down. Oh, good dog. Good dog, Mr. Knox. Good dog. That'll work pretty right. That's gonna work pretty right. Huh? What a good boy. Huh? So, can you move around in there? What do you think? Can you move around in there? Come here. Let me see you. Turn around. Come here, Knox. Oh, yeah, there's lots of room for a big dog like you. That's a good dog. Out. Come on. All right. All right. All right. Down. Okay. Okay, come on. Let's go. There you go. All right. What are you doing? You trying to go back up? Go ahead. You goofy critter. You goofy critter. Okay.
All right, guys, that about wraps this one up. Huge thank you to Craig Tools for sponsoring this video. That mortise mate is really, really cool. You should go check it out. There's links to all that stuff down below, all the codes, all the links, everything you might want to go check out what you saw in this video are down there. Also, I have plans available. It's not full encompassing, long, lengthy plans. It is a cut list. It is diagrams about how stuff goes together, and it's meant to go along with this video so you can build it yourself. If you don't have a dog, this is still a really nice piece of furniture, so you could build it for blanket storage or something like that. And in that case, if you don't want to be able to see the blankets inside, then you could use these panels differently. You could have solid, 1/4 inch plywood panels. You could leave the plastic solid.
You could even have a cutout like this and then put something behind it so that it has a little bit more relief, a little bit more design, but you can't see in to see whatever mess you got stashed in there. It could be used for a lot of different things. If you do want it to be a dog kennel and you don't have a way to cut out plastic panels, or you don't want to use wood that you could cut out yourself, I'm going to list the plastic panels as a product on my website as well. I don't know the pricing off the top of my head, or I'd tell you right now. I've got to work that out in the aftermath after getting this video finished. But also, if you'd like me to build you a kennel, we can figure that out. I'll build it and I'll hand deliver it if you just think you have to have one just like this. But I'm rambling now. Knox would like to go outside and play. And that's all I've got to say about that. Thanks, guys. I'll talk at you next time. You ready? Come on, let's go. Yeah, come on. You don't have to be in there right now. You did your job. Everybody saw how cute you are. Let's go. Let's go.